the bigger point I'm making here is this, that we have an instinct for stories, right? And what I've done here is it's a screenshot of your basic Wikipedia page, which is devoted to this one book called The 7 Basic Plots, Why We Tell Stories, by Christopher Booker. And on the left side, you can see some archetypal stories. And this is just one screenshot, but, somebody had mentioned Ramayana and Mahabharata earlier. And, the point is that we have all grown up in and with stories. We have basic templates of stories internalized, all of us, each one of us. And there may be variations in, depending on where we have grown up and what kind of stories we've grown up with, there'll be variations. But what is there for sure is that there's an instinct for story, an instinct for plot, for example, and what some different kinds of plots are. And people who've done work on this will say that actually all stories of the world, the aggregate of them can be boiled down to, some people will say 5, some people will say 7, some people will say 9 types of stories. And then, of course, there's variation and mixing and matching and all of that. But that it basically boils down to some fundamental archetypal plots. So, for example, there is the one kind of plot which is overcoming the monster, and of course here the monster means can be all kinds of variations. Overcoming a problem, it could be your typical good and bad, and go back to your Ramayana, Mahabharata, so many of those episodes. Ramayana certainly is one about the overcoming of the monster, right? But also, depending on how deep, big, and rich the story collection is, you may have elements of all these stories in different, embedded in this one large story. So the Mahabharata, for example, which runs into, I think whatever 18 or 20, whatever number of volumes, the point is that you may get these archetypal plots, right? Overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, tragedy, the idea of rebirth, the protagonist, reinvents or refines himself or herself in the duration of the story. So these are some, and I'm not saying that these are either the only ones, but I'm only suggesting here that these are very recognizable archetypal plots. And if you think about the kind of stories if you think about the way in which you tell stories or you hear stories, you will find that these elements are very, very recognizable things in how we deal with each other in fictional or real stories, right? And this instinct, it's internalized in all of us. And one would think that this has nothing to do with academic work. Okay, if you're in the literature department, then yeah, this is your work. You can spend 34 years to write this book. But if you're not in a literature department, if you don't write fiction, if you're not a short story or a long story or a novelist, why are we thinking about this, right? And I will come to that slowly. And this is where, where I was saying that, it came to me very powerfully, how we narrate arguments, how we formulate problems, have a lot to do with the way in which we have culturally internalized stories, but also we have taught ourselves to perhaps challenge those templates of stories and teach ourselves new templates. For example, if you think about templates of stories that are stereotypical and are prejudiced and have problems with it, we may have even educated ourselves about not telling that story that way or changing some element of it, right? And when we do research work, it occurs to me that it's not as if we are not coming from there. In fact, we might even think about embracing it more consciously, and we'll think about whether there is any use for that or not. So one important thing is to think about how each of these story templates actually formulate problems differently, right? So you may have in overcoming the monster, if the focus is on the community, right? Now think about Game of Thrones, which has communities as well as, protagonists, or stories out of Mahabharata or Ramayana or whatever. Now, depending on which kind of story you're telling, it could be the story of individuals, it could be stories of communities, it could be stories about, the environment, it could be, larger context and environment. So, but each of them will formulate the problem differently. And these internalized stories have to have a lot to do with the way in which we formulate problems and questions. So that's my basic premise for organizing this presentation / workshop like this, right? So then if I'm not a fiction writer, if I'm not a storyteller in the sense that, now I'm not engaged in literature in the way that we produce literature, but can we utilize some of those tricks in the way that we do tell real stories, right? So if you think about it, good research writing, and the quest is one of the items on the list. But the researchers are writers, are questers, right? That you are, and you look at the word, right? The quest is what, the word questions has the word quest in it, right? You are asking, you're questing, you are looking for something, and the word research itself is in being in search of, right? So if researchers are basically questers, and we give into that story instinct, and we have it. You don't have to learn it from outside. We all have it. We've grown up in stories. What happens if you pay attention to that, even for our research work? So I'm going to leave like an open-ended question. Maybe we can come back to it later on. So what do you think might happen to our research writing if we embrace our instinct for stories, right? And we don't have to be novelists for this. We don't have to be short story writers for this. What I'm saying is that there's an instinct for story, and that instinct for story has beginnings, middles, ends. It has questions. It has there's a questing, there are problems, there are questions. How do we deal with all of that? And there are templates by which we know how to deal with them as well, right? So the idea, for example, of that you really don't expect something to survive, and it does, right? And in fact, there are research articles which talk about those entities, or an individual, or a really small institution of some sort, which adapts itself and manages to survive and, really become a protagonist through a crisis. We, in fact, have an example among the links that I shared with you, right? So we'll come back to this question. I'll invite you to think about it. What might happen if we embrace our instinct for stories, even as we are doing research work? So that's the open-ended question that I'd like to come back to later. Now, the point is that, okay, so this is all on the data point of 1. Can we look at the other articles and find whether, and see whether what I have been pointing out so far is applicable and works in some of the other articles as well. So this is the EPW Engage article, and you have the link for that. Again, this one begins with a question, and unlike the previous example, this is not a statement, it's a question. And it's a question which is the research question. This is the problem. So COVID-19 happened, COVID-19 lockdown happened, and what happened to India's women enterprises during the COVID-19 lockdown, right? So that's your question at the heart of it, right? Gone straight to the problem. And if we quickly sort of run our eyes over the abstract or the synopsis, which is there in the italics, it sets up the scene, right? The pandemic affected the self-employed women. It tells you what it's looking at. Further non-payment of wages did blah. This article draws on findings from research conducted during the lockdown to understand the economic impact on women owned and led by enterprise. So if you go back to the templates I was talking about, this is about understanding a problem and its many complexities, right? So this is not one, I'm not expecting a solution here, right? I'm not expecting recommendations which tells me, well, okay, so because it's not even set up that way. It's like, how did it, I need to find out, how are they faring? Were they all right? And I have this question, and I go do the research, and I think that it's going to be a huge problem. Turns out that they thrive, right? We don't know. Till we do the research, we don't know. But this does not set itself up as one which is going to give a recommendation. It sets itself one as understanding a problem, understanding and explaining the complexity of a problem. And in that article, you will find very helpfully, right at the very beginning, this image, which makes, and so narrative is also not just about words. What it does is that it makes narrative available in pictures, figures, numbers, charts. Why do we have those things? Why do we have statistics? Why do we have numbers? Ultimately, actually, it is to help us narrate and consolidate and tell that story a little bit better than before, right? So the reason why we have, so then, the difference between, social sciences research will also think about the difference between qualitative research and quantitative research. And, there are all kinds of hierarchies that are then drawn between, how valid a research might be if there's more quantitative research, or, if there's a good qualitative question asked or not, or blind. What those complications in social sciences research end up being. But my point here is very simple, that even when there is the consolidation of data with the help of statistics, right, with the help of quantitative research, ultimately the point is to make it available in narrative, the job of the picture. So you have an image actually of a woman painting a pot. So you have a picture. What is the point of the picture? The idea is that, okay, women working small businesses, you're not looking at big corporate industry or anything, you're looking at small businesses, and the picture immediately tells you it is small, it's local, it's handicraft kind of things and other smaller businesses. So there's a picture there, and then look at the various elements on this page, right? So right away, COVID impact 19 on 2,000 plus women tells you right away, well, what was the size of my data sample, right? And it tells you, okay, how many closed down, temporarily closed, permanently closed, wholly operational, gives you the numbers. And you realize that actually quite a large number managed to stay partly operational, and quite a large number of closed down only temporarily. They opened up, right? So wholly operational or permanently closed was a smaller number. So that right away gives you a certain, you don't have to read many paragraphs to get that sense. Next one, 1 out of 2 respondents, blah, blah, blah. So here is the thing. So 1 out of 2 respondents who reported permanent closure. So then tells you also something about the method also. And if you move on, eventually, if you come to the last image, it talks about levels of stress women felt, and all these different images here with numbers, with percentages, with figures, help you narrate. And when you go back and look at that engaged piece, you realize that they have these, all of these have paragraphs devoted to them explaining what is going on, right? So you can get a snapshot, and what you're getting a snapshot is basically a narrative of what the problem is and the kind of questions that have been asked and what the sample is and what the data is. You get a sense for that. Eventually, you come to type of capacity building support required. So no recommendation, but a sense for what might help, because looking at the problems, what does it need, right? So it's not given as a recommendation per se, but it's given as, okay, what would help, right? So you get a snapshot, but it's utilizing all these other things that social sciences research has at its fingertips to also use. But my point is that this is also making narrative available. This is also narrating your data. This is also narrating your field. And this is an excerpt from the very last 2 paragraphs of the article. And I want to bring you back to what I said, right? This brings us back to the agency problem of women-led businesses. And then in the last one, the intersectionality of gender and entrepreneurship has received much attention, blah, blah, but there has been less progress when it comes to offering solutions with a gender lens. So there's not been, we can't offer a lot of solutions. It's still lagging behind. But what I need you to notice here is, again, the problem and the solution format, right? So this is the problem. This is the solution. There is no solution. In fact, there's less progress in figuring solution when we look at the problem from the lens of gender, for example, right? So in yet another article, what we were hoping, what I demonstrated to you with the first article, with a slightly longer, slightly more academic, more data, more attention to method, that kind of an article, also you see that the narrative here is a problem solution format narrative, right? So let's look at another example. This is, and here it's kind of a, can you see? When you look at the title, you see the role of last mile community workers in a pandemic, a case story. Here, in fact, the word story comes into the title itself, and you know that this is going to set up the scene. This is going to, this is the kind of story. If you think back on the kind of story templates, as I said, that we utilize in order to even narrate our research, this is the kind of story where a protagonist emerges from a crisis, right? The case story. So if you look at the description, provider, educator, surveyor, counselor, consoler, friend, Sapna Nair, and co-authors provide an inside look at the multiple roles that Tamil Nadu's frontline health workers are playing during this critical time, right? We learn that these heroic women are adapting in different ways, and technology has played a crucial role in ensuring continued, timely, and quality health and nutrition services, right? So turns out that here is a case study that adapted. So go back to that list, there is that rebirth, for example, template where, something is reborn through a crisis and becomes a protagonist. A very Harry Potter kind of template as well, that you were not expected to survive, and you do, and not only do you transform yourself and you become something that you become someone that can actually help the community. So again, going back to my point, that when we are making arguments to organize our research work, consciously or subconsciously, we are actually falling back on templates of fictional narratives, fictional storytelling that we have, that's just internalized. We may not even realize that that's where it's coming from, and that might be a connection. But looking at this work like this, I realized that actually that may be something that's worth looking into as we do this work. Next example is from yet another of the samples that were shared with me, and I will not say anything right now. So what do you think, right? So you have the title and you have the paragraph. What kind of story is this one telling? In the interest of time, I will be sending this PDF to you. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this and we can come back to it. I just have one more slide to share where I want to tie up the points that I've been talking about. I want us to have at least 10 minutes of discussion, so we can come back to this and you can try out what we talked about, whether this fits in that template or not. And as we do this, just want to run through, just sum up the points I wanted to make today, right? So what are my points? That to learn about narrating a story, you actually don't have to go anywhere else. Pay attention to how you listen to and tell stories, right? And we are immersed in stories, personal stories, stories we are reading, watching, whatever else. So trust your instinct on that. Pay attention to how different stories formulate problems differently, and in fact, solutions. I had this whole bunch of things prepared on solutions, and I realized I won't have time today. But there are also packed solutions in stories, packed conclusions, the ways in which stories end. And that list, if you go back to it, will give you a sense for how we expect different stories to end. And my sense is that when we are making coherent claims about our research work, again, we are falling back on those. Some may be open-ended, some may be perfectly tragic, some may be perfectly worked out very well, happy, some may be mixed. So all kinds of interventions, all kinds of stories. But again, there are some templates that we are falling back on. We can think about that. Your research writing, and indeed the work of research, if approached as a quest from which a story emerges, can actually make the work of research and writing very enjoyable. I think that's something we can consciously go to. How we formulate problems and ask questions determines much of the research and writing up, the point I made earlier. And for finer points, and this is something I've not talked about earlier, but that's what I demonstrated today, is that for finer points of figuring out how narrative or any element of writing works, study good examples of research writing that do so, right? So read to learn the craft of writing. So not just content, not just what VCs are and what the recommendation, but how, so the list of phrases, for example, that I underlined, that I highlighted for you, is one way to take away, okay, so what kinds of words and phrases can I use that can give me narrative link, that can give me narrative flow to connect different parts of my data and argument as I write it down. So these are my points, and I'm happy to take responses to the previous slide, but also any other questions. I know we have about 15 minutes left, and I wanted a little time for us to have a discussion as well. So I'm happy to go to any slide or stop slide sharing. I will do what you would like at this point. And if you could, some of you, if you would like to switch on your videos and have a discussion where you participate, I'm quite happy to have us do that as well.
Thanks, Ananya. Questions, please. You can post them directly or ask whatever you're comfortable with.
Yeah, so I'm happy to also sort of go back to this slide. So what kind of story is this work of research telling us? What is the problem? How are the solutions faring? What can we, you can, if it's not very legible on my slide, you have the reading, Samir shared the link earlier. Take a look at that. We can discuss this, but also any other observations, questions about how I'm suggesting we may approach the work of narrating our research and our data. I'd be happy to hear that now. Should I continue screen sharing or should I stop?
Hi, Ananya. This is Sabina here.
Hi, Sabina.
Hi. So I had one question. In the beginning, remember when you asked us about what narrative, what do we understand from narrative, and you gave us an order like the beginning, and then there's this introduction, there's middle, and there's this conclusion. Mm-hmm. So are there other interesting ways of presenting a narrative, or is it like mandatory to be in that format, or we can play around a little bit and change the way of presenting the narrative?
Okay, thank you so much for asking that question. And here is where I'll come back to this slide. So as I said, beginning, middle, and end to a narrative basically suggests that you set up a scene, then there's a complication, and then there's a resolution, classic format. But as we look at different types of storytelling, and depending on who you're writing for and where, you may be allowed to stray from that format or not, in the sense that I was looking at the policy brief. I did not include that example here. It was, but again, if you look at the subheadings in that one, the longer policy briefs also, there's a way in which certain kinds of writing will require you to follow a certain kind of format, right? So a policy brief format is expected to have, okay, you begin by describing what the problem is, then you do a literature review, then you say what the method was. And turns out that depending on where it's being published or what it's going to do, that genre is required and you can't play with that, right? But there may be other venues of writing, other places of presenting your research, which allow you to play with the format a little bit more. But even in the policy research, I think the importance of how we formulate the problem and the question and how we are narrating still comes back to what kind of story we are seeing in our data, right? So are we seeing a kind of story where there is an overcoming of a problem, right? Or are we seeing a kind of a story where, you know, something unexpected happens and you really didn't expect something to, like a David and a Goliath situation where, you know, you really don't expect the small guy to win, but the small guy wins, right? A tragedy. You see something and you're like, this is utter failure, did not work at all. Are you narrating a tragedy, right? Now, depending on what that template is, what you see your research work showing, and I'm saying that this has a lot to do with the kind of stories we have internalized also, depending on your venue, then you may have the chance to actually narrate it differently. So you may now, in the very first example we saw, Fabrizio actually introduces a character. There is Rajinder and there is his wife Aditi, and Aditi lives in this village, right? So depending on where you're writing, what you're writing for, I think there is room to play. But it depends on what the venue of the publication is how I would qualify that answer, because that is something we need to really pay attention to as well. So if you are writing in a kind of, and these days a lot of fun things are coming out. There are these genres. People do photo essays, people do video essays, people do part interviews that are recorded, part written. So these mixed genres, for example, allow you to tell a story differently. So if you're playing with any of that, if there's room for you to put your work out like that, then yes, I think those will take a lot more fun ways to combine. And how do you do that? Again, look at these stories. Fiction is the best place to tell you. Movies, you watch movies. How is the narrative going? You give the beginning first, or sometimes the beginning comes in the end. There's a very, very well-known novel by Marquez, which I love very much. And that novel is called Chronicles of a Death Foretold, right? So you already know a murder is going to happen, right? Right away, you know a murder is going to happen. Typically in a murder mystery, or whatever, the murder has, in a suspense, sorry, not a murder mystery, but a suspense or a thriller, the idea is, the murder will happen in the end and take you by surprise. But here a murder is going to happen. It's Chronicle of a Death Foretold. You know the death is going to happen. So what typically happens in the end happens in the beginning, and then the story goes back to the beginning, right? So watching movies, reading stories gives you various ways to reorganize narrative. Pay attention to that. And some of it is certainly possible to bring, given the venue that you can put your work out. So I hope that answered your question. It was a long one, I realized the answer. Bhavya, you had your hand up.
It did, thank you.
Yeah, so hi, Professor Anannya. Thank you so much for this session. I think it was very enriching and very engaging, and plus, I think 1,000 for those memes. But I think what I wanted to ask is, so I work as a research associate here, right? Which means that I have just begun as a researcher. And what I fail to sometimes do is there's a lot of information that I can gather well, and that's all okay. But how do I put all of that in the sense, synthesize all of that in a way that you've, like, I agree that you've given us a template, and it's more for us to, read and sort of understand how to deploy that template to write better. But sometimes, the problem of plenty happens. There's so much that I want to sort of write in a blog or in sort of a research piece, but I just don't know how much is too much and where to stop. Sometimes it's okay because I think Deeksha and everybody gave us a word limit that a blog is supposed to be XYZ long, and then that. But just for example, if I want to explore and write something up for myself, which is again used for future publication, etc., how do I know where to stop? Because everything I think is very relevant for my readers to know.
So again, I think the way to, so this happens to all of us, that we start doing research, and there's a lot of material, and a lot of material that's not organized in any way. There are, pockets of different kinds of interesting things, and it's all in a mess, right? It's not organized coherently. And, since it doesn't grow on trees, it doesn't get organized by itself. You are the organizing principle. And when you told me that, okay, so then Deeksha tells me it's a blog post, or Deeksha tells me, no, this has to go in a policy brief. So that material, quite often, it will never happen that every bit of that entire material will become one thing, right? Anybody who's done research will tell you that you do a bunch of research, you collect a lot of material, and then depending on what you are producing out of it, you go to that material and you try to get as much of that material to make sense to you for that purpose. And again, so if it's a blog post, it comes with a theme and a topic and a way, and the first thing you have to do is then formulate the problem or the question, right? And I'm not saying that the research material is only lending itself to one question or one problem, right? So combining and recombining different parts of the research work will allow you to ask different questions will allow you to ask different, pose different problems. And that becomes your organizing node is what I'm suggesting today, right? So if you have asked one question and one problem, and you immediately see that some portion of the research begins to cohere around that. And that would be one way. And sometimes you do a smaller piece of work, sometimes you do a bigger piece of work, the questions change. And as I said, you also combine and recombine different sources, make different texts sit next to each other, look at the data. You have numbers, you have figures, you have interviews, you have all kinds of data. And then the putting it into narrative, I'm suggesting, depends on which parts you're combining when, for what purpose, and what questions you're asking. I think that's where it will begin to help you to figure that out. Quite often it happens that you see one pattern in it and are able to see it in bigger and bigger portions of the data. And that helps you to do a bigger work with it, present a bigger work with it, and make a bigger claim as well. So we also moderate the size of our claim, saying, okay, I've only done this much, and here I can say that. And there's absolutely room to be able to do that. I hope that answered your question, Bhavya.
Yes, it did. Thanks, Professor.
Okay, great. So are there any other...
We have a couple more questions on the chat. Maybe we can quickly take them and then wrap up.
Where did Samir go?
I can read them out. So there's one from Karthikeya. Okay. He's also the one of the authors of the EPW Engage piece. So Karthikeya, question is that I wanted to know how to sound less repetitive in narrating data from a big study. Okay. I'm a co-author in the EPW article, and it was quite troubling with finding newer ways of telling that story. So
yeah, so I think what I'm suggesting here is to think about the templates of the story, right? So you pick one kind of template. So Karthikeya, is it possible for you to talk? May I request you, if it is possible, to think about the work that you did for the EPW Engage in terms of a story template. What story did you tell?
So it was mostly...
Karthikeya, you might have to start again. I couldn't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just saying the story was about those 2,000 enterprises.
Right.
And I remember I was circling between the women and the enterprises as the characters, just to provide some diversity in the narration.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, there were only so many ways to do it.
Okay. No, I won't agree with that, Karthikeya. Now, when I look at that poster, I love that poster, that snapshot of everything that we did. You could actually think about, so, there was that entire little bit, and of course, I don't know your research. I don't know how much material you actually have for each one of those sections. If you were to pay attention to each one of those sections and the questions and problems they pose. So for example, you have a section on stress and how different, and there are numbers associated with how many women are responding. Some women, and that's a very small number, which says that they're not stressed very much at all, or that they're highly stressed, but the middle, which says that they're considerably more stressed now, right? And there, if you begin to start looking at the data from the point of what they mean by stress, for example, right? And I don't know what kind of questions you asked and what you gather, but what I'm saying is that if you were to re-look at this entire problem from the point of view of personal mental health and stress, actually your questions would change, your problem would change, and your narrative would change. Does that seem plausible, Karthikeya?
Yeah, it does, Professor.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple of more questions. Maybe we can take one and then wrap up and then come back to you and the team with some others. So Aishwarya mentions, okay, wait, I'm using lots of questions now. Any tips on how to maintain a healthy balance of that emotional human element along with your big picture data and the existing scholarship that you integrate your findings into, especially when narrating qualitative research?
Yes. So now there is no formulaic answer to this, because it again depends on what kind of research you've done and what you are writing about. So for example, if your work is on, say, sexual violence, or or violence that women face, how are you going to say that the proportion, the human element, or what the amount you're talking about people in it, obviously that's going to be a lot, right? That's going to be the chunk of your work. You're not going to be so that proportion is going to be very high because that's your work. Now let's look at the first example I had, where the real protagonist is the BC. The protagonist is not Rajinder, it's not Aditi, right? So the human element there was there to only show you that this is important, that the BC, the work that the BCs are doing is important. Now there, if you wanted to come back again, maybe with an anecdote about Rajendra and Anita, which is relevant to something, fine. But otherwise, actually, the reader is not expecting a whole lot about Rajendra and Anita at all, right? So there, the work is about explain what GST TDS is. Why is this a problem? Even though it is, it seems to be privileged, why is it still not working? Where is the hitch? That's where the emphasis. So I won't say there's a 50-50 balance or a 40-70. It's entirely dependent on your question. It's entirely dependent on your research. If your research is on human elements, then it has to be the majority part of your writing also, right? So that one, there is no formulaic answer to it. It depends on the work that you do.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, it's time now. So Diksha, are we ready to wrap up now? Preeti, is she still around? I know she's sort of.
She's listening in.
Yeah,
But
I'm here. Sorry, I'm just on the road. Thanks so much, Ananya, for this wonderful session.
See, you're on the road, you're questing.
And as you mentioned, like, it'll be great to, it'll be great to have an ongoing engagement with CWP as well. Like, if you can give us exercises, etc., to the team, I think that would be wonderful. And thanks so much. This has been really great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I had a lot of fun preparing this. If you have any other questions, feel free to write to me, and we'll see how we can follow up with this. Thank you so much, Diksha, Preeti, and all of you for participating and engaging. Thank you so much. And thank you, Samir.
Thanks, Samir, as well as the team. Yeah.
Thanks to everybody. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye.